Ex-Millionaires of Reddit, what made you lose all your money? I built a business worth 3 million, had a house worth 1.4 million, investments worth more than 2 million, 4 nice cars. Divorce laid me low. An ex-wife, a lawyer, and a judge stripped me of at least 3/4 of that. Left me with a Miata race car, a bit of money and 51% of my company. Still had to pay alimony. I gave up. I negotiated my way out of alimony by giving up more of the company, liquidated everything else, bought a boat and freaked off. 26 months later I sailed back into my life and started over. I've earned enough to live a modest retirement, and that's where I'm today. Don't get married, boys, it ain't worth it. I've done it twice. The first time was a disaster, the second time was an annoyance. Just my opinion and experience. I'm way too drunk and shouldn't have posted. Anyway, there it is. My dad retired quite well off after a long and fulfilling career. 2 weeks after retirement, he got diagnosed with cancer. He had good insurance, so a lot of the treatment was covered. But turns out, living with cancer is costly in a lot of other ways. My mom became a full-time caregiver. I was stuck in grad school. My sister was still in undergrad. He was still on the hook for our education, while our income was zero. They needed someone to make fresh meals for them thrice a day because my dad kept getting infections if he ate food from outside, and my mother couldn't keep up. Also, he began having food sensitivities, and it became expensive getting things he could stomach. Then he needed a counselor coming home a few times a week, and that got expensive. And my sister moved back home to help care for him, and then her commute cost extra, and I had to fly back around the world to see him a couple of times. Then he needed a trained caregiver part-time, and then full-time as he got worse. Then the surgery, and then the medical items to keep his care going got really expensive when the good quality ones needed to be shipped from abroad. There was also all the special foods and supplements to boost his health and immunity. Long story short, he made it a little past the 2 years the doctors told us he would. But by the end of it, our finances had been significantly depleted. About a year in, I quit grad school and got a paying job. It was too much uncertainty financially to stay in grad school, especially since my sister was in a field that paid well only several years in. It worked out career-wise, so I don't regret it, and I was able to make enough to pay for his surgery when insurance was iffy. My sister had to refuse a couple of good jobs because they involved travel, and she wanted to stay close by to take care of him. After he passed, we really had to overhaul our finances because some of his assets got tied up in litigation and cost us a lot in legal fees to transfer it to my mother's name. But thankfully my career began paying off and I could cover it all, no sweat. Eventually I saved enough to allow my sister to go to grad school, but for a few years we were all living paycheck to paycheck, mine, which was a shame given how diligently my father had saved and invested. We also finally got access to some of his assets and passive income streams, so now my mother has a modest income which she can live independently on. First husband was making $1 million a year. He was enjoying life, spending frivolously, but bringing in enough that it didn't matter. We divorced, but amicably, no alimony, no child support. He just paid for whatever the kids needed. Then he got leukemia. He fought like heck for 3 years. The last 2 years were very expensive. It was worth it. Money won't make you happy, but the lack of it can destroy you. The kids and I can take comfort in knowing that truly, there was nothing else possible. His millions bought his kids 2 more years of dad. And I'm glad for him that he enjoyed his life while he could. Technically not me, but rather my family. My great-grandfather was born to a long line of vicars who had land, properties, and farms. They were loaded. He was the rebel-only son and swore that he would break tradition, so he joined the army, and come World War II he was shipped off to fight for Britain. While overseas, he was captured and spent a few years in a POW camp, where he subsequently found Jesus. After the war, he returned, joined the clergy, and, his father having died, gave every single penny to the goddamn church. Land, property, and titles all, and lived of his vicar's salary. Obviously it was never mine to lose, but the knowledge that I could have been a lord with a horse and an affordable coke addiction really stings. Not me, but my great-grandfather started a candy company that serviced most of the Wyoming Valley and PA. My grandfather, his son, sold the company for upwards of 100 million. My mother and I are unsure of the full amount. He used the money to buy some land down in Florida, franchised a few Radio Shacks, and bought a lot of cars. During this time he divorced my grandmother and married another woman with children. Towards the end of his life, he reconnected with my mother and met me, but then developed brain cancer. He decided to cut his wife out of his will and give all of his money, still around 10 million, to my mother and her brother. Because he was bedridden, he had to have his lawyer email and print out the new will, which he would sign and mail out to the lawyer. But he asked his wife that he was screwing over to mail the new will, but for some reason it got lost. He died a few days later with my mother unaware the will change hadn't gone through. She paid for the funeral, only to learn afterwards from her lawyer that the will was never changed. She went to confront her stepmother only to find out that she and her sons had already flown to Florida, taken the money and moved. She tried for a few years to sue, but due to state laws and lack of written evidence couldn't get the suit off the ground. And that's how my mother lost a multi-million-dollar inheritance and got stuck with a $50,000 funeral bill. My dad is an ex-millionaire. He's a freaking wizard at starting successful businesses. His problem is he can't let them go. He's the boss/owner who never hires a manager that's not family because he just doesn't trust anyone else to run it. He drove $3 million companies into the ground because he couldn't keep up with his own success and refused to hire people to do it for him. My dad, not me. He made some really shrewd stock market investments after he retired. They were options on an oil refiner at a time when the USA had a real shortage of them. My dad had done a lot of research on this and studied the situation carefully. He got rich to the tune of maybe $2 million. He could have been set for life. My dad was already a really smart guy. He has a PhD in mathematics and was a highly respected big brain professional all the way back into the 1960s. However, he thought this took him to the next level. He bought a lot of newer options in the same company. I suggested to him that he diversify, put a bunch of money into something closer to an annuity or another conservative investment that would give him plenty of income forever. I told him if he did that, he would always be rich. Well, he is pretty far from that now. I haven't said a thing about that to him since he lost everything. I did what I could at the time to save him from himself. But who was I? It pains me to see how it played out for him. He did a lot of things right in life. He deserved better, but there's no deserve in securities investing. Morals of this story: you aren't an investment genius after your first blockbuster win. You need a track record. Diversify. A common template for wealth loss is underestimating the role of luck in the initial wealth accumulation, and, as a result, taking irresponsible risks on new ventures and or maintaining lifestyles that overestimate future earning potential. I have seen this with some folks who made money in finance in the 80s and 90s. While extremely smart and hardworking, their path to tens or hundreds of millions of dollars were also pretty lucky. I watched a guy at a casino somehow get a loan against his house, about $200k, and lose it. He looked suicidal. Apparently he was already in almost $50k and thought he could win it back. I got hired there, and I would leave on Friday and return Monday and see the same people in the same clothes who messed up themselves and were still sitting at the blackjack table gambling. My grandfather was a thrifty man. Always was a DIY guy, hated hiring contract workers, except for my father, whom he introduced to my mother, and worked for nearly 40 years at our local GM plant. His savings, myriad cash deposits, and investments over the years netted him a net worth of about 2 or 3 million. After walking off the job at GM after a scuffle with the plant management, he went into business for himself and became a landscaper and evergreen farmer at 64 years old, earning government contracts with county and local agencies, which netted him another sizable chunk of money. His sister's husband did the same thing essentially, and this is where my aunt comes in. We will call her Karen. Karen worms her way into my great aunt's life, and as my great aunt approached her 80s started becoming more frail, and Karen took care of her, which means she had my great aunt sign over power of attorney and immediately signs everything over to herself. Brand new house, all 3 cars, RV, everything. Consigns my great aunt to a convalescent home where she died, the will having been officially amended to award everything not already taken by Karen to Karen. My other great aunt died suddenly and left my mother as her executor of her modest will, which was basically the stuff in her house, as she was in the process of selling the house. I was very young, but I remember mom loading me and my 2 brothers into the car and flying down the highway to beat Karen to the house before anything turned up missing. We were successful and mom got to inventory and disperse everything properly. We ended up with, of all things, her turn of the century pasta crank and her big box of recipes. Grandpa by this point had developed cancer and slowed down his business. Now 75 years old, he had a nice, modest house on a nice chunk of extremely valuable land thanks to the explosive development there. Mom takes time off work to help grandma care for him until he too passes away, leaving everything to grandma. At this point, we move into grandma's house to help her around the house and to help her close and liquidate the business assets. After about a year, Karen worms her way in like a tick and things start disappearing, like farm equipment and other things. Her daughter's husband also had gone into the storage barn and trashed out a lot of family heirlooms, which also was where we kept a lot of our furniture from our home, which all ended up in a fire pit behind the barn. It wasn't long after this that Karen convinced grandma to let her handle her finances and Karen evicts us. Within 2 years, they sold the family home and land, liquidated all of grandpa's stocks and bonds, and fled to Florida. Karen had once again gained power of attorney and legally stole all of grandma's remaining assets. Grandma died ignominiously when she was given an insulin shot 20 times her supposed dose, and she went into DKA and died slowly and horribly in brain death. Out of an estimated $4 million inheritance, mom and her 2 sisters were given an equal inheritance of $12,000. Karen kept the house, the cars, and ended up burning through everything. Obviously this ended up shattering the family, and now none of us speak to the other.